So here's something, Bishen. The Act calls the person who raises the complaint an aggrieved woman.
Yeah.
So therefore specifying woman,
Yes.
right? Interestingly, the Act calls the respondent or the alleged perpetrator these two terms, which are frankly gender neutral.
Yeah. Good day and welcome to this episode of the Posh Pod. We are in season 2 right now. Your host for today are Laxmi Char, co-founder Parity Consulting, an organization that works in the diversity and inclusion space. I am Bishen Jeswant, a partner at Cyril Amachan Mangaldas, a law firm, and I work primarily in the employment law space, focusing on anti-sexual harassment laws. So on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the law around sexual harassment and how it impacts the pride community, persons in the LGBTQI community, LGBTQI plus, I should say. We'll go into a few different aspects of it to break it down to see if the law is adequate or if any changes are required to, meet the requirements of today's times. Lakshmi?
Yeah. So, Bishan, this is something which I've been kind of mulling over, right? And especially in today's world, the law is definitely, the POSH Act, right, 2013, is definitely progressive in the sense that it collates and brings together a lot of elements which are better than what a woman at the workplace had pre the Act, right? So that's great. That's wonderful. I don't find the Act particularly inclusive. And coming from the diversity inclusion world, right, this definitely has been a question mark. So while the POSH Act protects women at the workplace, it does not necessarily lend the same protection to people who are across the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So the first step that most organizations do is to say, hey, love the POSH Act, let's make it gender neutral. Let's have a gender neutral policy. And we therefore expect, we the organization therefore expect that as we become more conscious and more respectful of having members of the pride community in our workplace, that we continue to extend to them the same respect and protection that we have extended to women, right? The challenge over here is that the act has certain powers and certain authority, which seems to be limited to the IC while investigating or while handling a complaint raised by a woman.
Yeah.
What do you see as an opportunity to address that challenge?
Okay, so it's quite clear that the POSH Act only deals with complaints raised by women.
Yeah.
Right. Now, when we talk about the LGBTQI plus community, there are various classes of people who comprise
Yes.
that category. It's a large spectrum, like you said.
Yes.
Now, for example, gender orientation, sexual orientation, probably does not impact the application of the POSH Act because it's clear that the POSH Act applies to complaints raised by women. Sexual orientation is not linked to gender identity as such, right? And therefore, on the LGBT, on the SOGI spectrum, persons whose gender or sexual orientation affects the identity are unlikely to be impacted by the POSH Act, right? In fact, in the sense that the way in which the Act applies will not be different.
So here's something, Bishan. The Act calls the person who raises the complaint an aggrieved woman.
Yeah.
So therefore specifying woman,
Yes.
right? Interestingly, the Act calls the respondent or the alleged perpetrator these two terms, which are frankly gender neutral.
Yeah.
Right? From a sexual orientation perspective, if there is a lesbian complaint, so in other words, a woman is complaining about sexual harassment by another woman, does the Act apply in all its glory and power?
Most certainly, yes.
Okay.
Right? Just like you said, aggrieved woman is the only relevant party. Here, the person is an aggrieved woman, identifies as a woman, sexual orientation not relevant. And the respondent is also a woman. The term respondent is gender neutral. It can be a woman. So the Act would very much apply. Now, most questions under the act and whether it would apply in all its glory, like you said, come into the question when there's when there's an issue of gender identity.
Yes.
Right. And I think the best example of it would be to talk about transgender persons. Right. To say that a transgender person, as defined under the Transgender Persons Act in India, is clearly a person whose gender assigned at birth does not match with a gender identity.
Yes.
Right? Now, that can be a man or it can be a woman.
Yes.
Now, so trans men and trans women are both transgender persons under Indian law. Now, would they be covered and would they be able to file a complaint under the POSH Act and have the benefits of all the statutory processes? Right? Let's talk in this example. So there are two ways of seeing it. One, we know that aggrieved woman is defined under the POSH Act, right? Person who's employed, not employed, but has to be a woman. Woman is not defined under the POSH Act.
No.
Right? So you can interpret woman to mean
a trans woman.
You can interpret it in two ways. One, to mean a woman who is a woman by the gender assigned at birth, or a woman based on the gender they identify with.
Yes.
Whichever interpretation you take, and let's say that keeping with the times today, a court would take the interpretation that it is your gender identity which matters and not the gender assigned at birth.
Correct.
In that situation, all transgender persons can most certainly not be covered under the act, because whatever was your gender assignment at birth and now your gender identity is different, right? So half the transgender population is not going to get covered whichever interpretation you take.
True.
Because if they were assigned female at birth and they now identify as a man based on the interpretation we just discussed, they cannot be covered despite being assigned female at birth. And the reverse, if you're assigned male at birth and now you identify as female, you're covered, but still half the population has been excluded.
Yes.
And I think that is the reality of the situation, because there is going to be a population that is excluded because the act only is intended to cover women. Right? That's just the reality of it. And for the benefit of the viewers, since the act only covers women, an employer can have a gender neutral policy, no doubt, covering transgender persons and everybody on the LGBTQI plus spectrum. However, when the complaint pertains to a complainant who is a woman, who is not a woman, various parts of the act won't apply in their full force. For example, the IC may not have the powers of a civil court when asking for evidence or when requiring witnesses to come and testify. The provisions of appeals under the act to a statutory body may not apply unless the woman is the respondent, a woman is the complainant. Things like that. So while you can still have a process, the teeth that the law provides will not be available.
So couple of things. We do have in India the Transgender Persons Act.
Yeah.
And we do have a referral in that act towards anti-sexual harassment of transgender people, right? I mean, and maybe a little bit more about that. The second half of the question will be, can an organization use its service rules to grant itself the teeth that you referred to?
No, because whatever powers an employer grants itself cannot extend to the government. Right? So an appeal mechanism, for example, is a government statutory appeal process outside of the employer who has to hear appeals. We cannot give, an employer cannot give that outside body this power.
Fair.
Right? And the IC has the powers of a civil court, and that power is coming from the act. So unless the act changes and says that you will have the powers of a civil court as the IC, even when the complaint is not from a woman, you cannot grant that power. The employer cannot grant that power. The law needs to change for that purpose. What was your first question, Laxmi?
I said in the Transgender Persons Act. Yeah.
Right. So the Transgender Persons Act is actually an interesting legislation to discuss. And the law around it is actually quite confusing, because the Transgender Persons Act, like you said, says that for sexual abuse of transgender persons, there is a penalty under the act. I think it's imprisonment of 2 years. So it's quite a serious penalty. The Transgender Persons Act also says that there cannot be discrimination against transgender persons at the workplace. Specifically, it says that, right? So if you read those together, no sexual abuse and no discrimination at the workplace, you could argue that they are protected against sexual harassment, right? But there is a mechanism under the Transgender Persons Act of a complaints officer to address those complaints.
Yes.
So then these complaints are supposed to go to the complaints officer,
And
not
not
under the
PIC.
POSH Act, right? So then how do we read those two complaints mechanisms together? I don't think we can automatically say that because transgender persons are protected from sexual abuse and discrimination at the workplace, the POSH Act automatically covers them. The issue I said earlier still remains that half that population is going to remain excluded, whichever way you interpret a woman, whether assigned at birth or based on identity.
That's so interesting. So if we apply the POSH Act to transgender people, half, the community is not covered. But applying the Transgender Persons Act then implies that while coverage is extended to everybody, but it is not the POSH coverage, right? It is coverage through a specific complaints officer and perhaps a different mechanism, which has not been laid down in the Act, not like the POSH Act. And therefore, the employer has a whole lot of leeway over there, right? To letter and spirit, maybe to not necessarily apply it through in letter and spirit. There's another challenge that employers face today, and again, from a parity's perspective, we're seeing this because, as like I said, organizations are becoming, frankly, more welcoming and more inclusive of people across the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender identity. We are also seeing society as a whole, as younger generations come into the workplace, right? I mean, forget the millennials now, they're passé. We've got the next generation already knocking at the doors. And they are significantly more open in terms of accepting individuals and human beings as individuals and human beings and not necessarily slotting them into categories. Our culture hasn't quite caught up as yet because there is still that, that stigma of sexual orientation. And the reality is that while our society may feel a certain sense of sympathy or even pity when it is a person with disability, we still struggle a little bit when it is a person who's not heteronormative, right? I mean, there is that this thing. So that sensitivity from an organization's perspective, I want to have a gender neutral policy. Yeah. I want to have as much teeth to my policy as it is possible to have. I want to be sensitive to the fact that there might be folks who are part of my workforce, not necessarily out of the closet, so to speak, right? Is there any, kind of legal guidance that we can provide organizations who are looking to do the right thing?
So, okay, we'll come to the employer. I want to talk about the same issue that you're talking about, being sensitive to the today's day and age and how people are perceived today. I think our courts are moving in the right direction as well, right? In the last few years, we have seen the Nalsa judgment, which recognizes transgender persons as the third gender. Right? We have seen decriminalization of 377. Somehow, though, so those are undoubtedly positive steps, right? There's no question about it. But the fact is that that's created a little bit more confusion with respect to the POSH Act. And this impacts employers as well, because recognition of a third gender, as soon as you say that they are a third gender, the court has the right intent here, no doubt, right? Because you're trying to grant them the rights. For example, recently there was, not so recently, but the first transgender police officer in Tamil Nadu. Correct. It was possible because they were able to mark themselves as a third gender, not as male and female, and still apply, because otherwise they weren't able to mark themselves as either. But under the POSH Act, it's clear that the POSH Act only applies to one gender. And when you say that transgender persons are a third gender, you are implying that you are not the one gender the Act applies to, right? So you could extend that argument to say that no one in the transgender community is covered under the POSH Act. Ouch. Not even half the way that I was saying earlier. It's possible to make that argument. So there is a little bit of fine-tuning of the law required to harmonize the various different legislations and judgments. And when that happens, that will also help employers to be sensitive. I wanted to give this context to answer your question, because an employer can't just change the scenario and the background and the context we live in, because there is so much else to it. So unless some of the other things in the background change, the law and the way which is applied, decisions of the court, etc., it may not be possible for an employer to bring about a complete change because that may not be in line with the law.
That's really interesting. And again, as we are seeing society push the legal community, right, to become more aware of all of these social changes, perhaps there'll also be a case where the POSH Act itself could be reviewed and rewritten in a more gender neutral form, right?
Absolutely.
Something that Bishen, you had mentioned to me in a completely different context. You had said one of the kind of strengths, if you like, of Indian jurisprudence is that once there is a need felt, the law tends to react to that need.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you think, from a pride community perspective, for anybody out there who's an ally, who's part of the community, what can we do to kind of register that need, right? What is it that lies in our power to raise our voices?
I think, Laxmi, the answer is talking about it. Right? So now, law is ultimately a reflection of society. Right? It is society's law is nothing but our values and ethics codified in a law form. Which is why you see in some countries across the world, homosexuality is still a crime. In some countries across the world, law does not permit capital punishment. But in some countries they do. And that's a reflection of what the people of that country, of what society thinks is acceptable.
Yeah.
So as we move further, society will come around to accepting persons on the LGBTQI plus community more. Right? You will see more transgender persons who are part of mainstream corporate India, which you don't see today. Today, you like the example I gave, the Tamil Nadu cop. You still hear reports about this being the first transgender person who has become a cop. There was recently, I think, in Chhattisgarh, the first transgender person who became a mayor of Raigad, I think. Right? And there was, Tamil Nadu seems to have a few examples. The first transgender TV show host, first transgender news anchor.
Correct.
We are still in the stage of saying firsts, right? We need to get to a point where this is normal, which is when employers will feel the need more as well for the act to adapt. Today, that need is not felt so strongly because persons on the spectrum, on the LGBTQI plus spectrum, are not so commonly seen in the corporate Indian workspace.
So openly.
Yeah. So when that happens, when we are able to encourage people to come out, be their true self, and there are more people in mainstream corporate India, is when the need for the change will be felt, right? And then we will see the change happen. And I think the examples I may have given earlier also are in the last, since 2016, we have seen the HIV Act come in.
Yes.
We have seen the Persons with Disabilities Act come in. We have seen the Transgender Persons Act come in.
Yeah.
And the POSH Act itself was only about 10 years old.
Correct.
So we have seen change.
Yes.
The laws are changing to keep in sync with society.
Yeah.
So as the changes that we're talking about happen, I think you will see the POSH Act change as well, to be specifically inclusive of transgender persons, and eventually, if the need comes, maybe become gender neutral as well. That's not the need of the hour today, because clearly harassment is felt more by women than it is by men. And the weaker sections of society, like transgender persons, are also targeted. So that's definitely a part of society which needs to be addressed, which has been addressed partly through the Transgender Act, but that needs to now be seen in the POSH Act as well. And I'm hopeful because of the changes we have seen in the past. So I think it will happen when society's requirements change, when our outlook and mindset changes.
Yeah. Come on, folks. Outlook and mindset change. Raise your voice. Join the conversation. Write into us. Tell us if you enjoyed this episode. If you did, like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening in and watching.